Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's event. And just before we start, I would ask anyone who's actually on the WebEx. So we've got this seminar being streamed live via the WebEx system. Could you please mute? And that's all, I think. All right. Okie doke. So good afternoon and welcome. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. Welcome everyone to Data61. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Liz Jakubowski, Director of Ribit.net. Ribit's a platform for connecting students to meaningful work. We do that through a digital online matchmaking platform and face-to-face speed networking events, and also through our research into the marketplace, which provides some unique data insights. You'll be hearing about that a little bit more shortly. We operate out of Data61, which is the part of the CSIRO, which deals with all things data-related. And we have some fantastic data scientists working with us, two of which you'll be meeting shortly, along with our international guest today, Matthew Sigelman. We've got some great people in the audience too. I think I've said hello to some of you already. We've got people from government, corporate, research, academia, student community. We've even got an editor from the student newspaper. We've got media, Stuart, small business, online platforms, Fiona, and of course the startup community, and lots of great people, I'm sure, online as well. So basically what today is about is really, I think, significant for everyone in the room. You'll be listening to industry and academic experts, but what we're doing with their research is trying to, I guess, turn it around and come up with some practical solutions to some of the issues that we keep on hearing about, future of workforce and jobs disappearing. And I think there's some very, very interesting insights they'll all be sharing. We'll be hearing from the speakers first, and then we're going to follow up with a Q&A session, which I really encourage everyone in the audience to participate in. Knowing quite a lot of you already in the audience here, you've all got opinions, and we welcome them through questions to our panel, who'll be up here to share their thinking about it. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, who is Claire Mason, to the front to speak. A little bit of background about Claire. Claire's a CSIRO Data61 social scientist, and she's just recently published her findings on workforce issues for Australia. You might have heard in the media over the last few weeks, Claire's been talking to quite a few people about some of the insights that she's found. So she'll be sharing that through her presentation now, and after that we'll be hearing from our international speaker, Matt, and followed at the tail end by Paul McCarthy. So welcome, Claire.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you all for the opportunity to share the research today. I normally depend on notes, so let's hope I can manage without them. The work I'm talking about today is actually the product of a very large team of researchers and 3 different projects. And the first one I'm going to talk about, Tomorrow's Digitally Enabled Workforce, is a foresighting piece, which attempts to identify the long-term and broad-reaching forces for change, which are changing the nature of our work and the way in which we deliver our work in the future. And I'll move on from that to then talk about how these megatrends are playing out in terms of demand for skills in the Australian workforce. So the 6 megatrends that we identified through engagement with experts and analysis of many different sources of data were rapid technology development, porous boundaries, the era of the entrepreneur, divergent demographics, the rising bar in tangible and intangibles. I'm going to go through these very quickly. But the most important of these is probably the first, rapid technology development. And here we're looking at a graph. It's actually an exponential growth axis. And this is a very famous piece of work which found that the computational power of computers has been growing exponentially, and simultaneously the cost of that computational power has been decreasing exponentially. And that same exponential pattern of growth is being seen in other domains, such as the number of connected devices that we have and the volumes of data that are being produced. And the key thing when we have a pattern of growth like this is that the impacts really only begin to pile up and be felt really strongly once we get to the second half of that growth curve. And according to experts, that exponential effect in computational power and artificial intelligence has yet to really play out in the Australian labour force. And estimates of the effect of all this automation vary, but they generally vary from around 9% to 47% of the work that human workers are currently doing could be automated within the next 15 or so years. The second trend is called porous boundaries, and this is about traditional boundaries, say between national labour markets or between organisations, are beginning to break down. So the more that we deliver our work via digital channels, the more that we can outsource that work to overseas workers who are generally lower cost. So that effectively we now have one big global labour market, which obviously poses something of a concern for Australia with its high labour cost. Then we also have the traditional rationale for us working in organisations, which is that it is difficult for any one individual to perform all the functions required to produce something, to market something, to sell it, to ensure that you get paid for it. And that was the reason why we all began working in organisations. But because digital platforms now provide things like standardised contracts and virtual shops and marketing functions, it is now less necessary for us to all be working in large organisations in order to be effective. So we may see a move away from traditional employment structures. And indeed, we are already seeing the growth of superstars like Google and Apple, which have incredibly high market capitalisation relative to the number of people that they employ. And of course, we have digital platforms, which mean that we can now work peer-to-peer. And we're seeing these platforms grow up even in terms of selling our own labour, so that these are all platforms that people can use to find work as a freelancer or as a portfolio worker. And while the uptake of this freelancing sort of work has been relatively slow in Australia, what I'm showing you here is some global data on the uptake of global co-working spaces and also the number of people registered on freelancer.com as freelance workers. And you can see that, again, we have this exponential pattern of growth. Because of these things, the effect of technology and these more porous boundaries, we believe that in the future, fewer people will be able to find a job in a traditional organisational role. And as a result, people will need to find their own work or their own way of adding value. And so it will be the era of the entrepreneur. We'll need to have more entrepreneurial aptitudes and mindsets. And part of what's facilitating this is also the digital platforms which exist that make it possible for the person in the street with relatively little capital to sell their product to a global niche market. And then we have the fourth trend, I believe, which we're calling divergent demographics. And this is about the labour force becoming increasingly diverse. The graph that I'm showing you on this slide is the proportion of people over the age of 65. And when you look at this graph, it shows that by 2055, more than 8 million Australians will be over the age of 65. So we have far fewer people of traditional working age to provide the tax base to fund aged care services. And many Australians do not have adequate superannuation to be able to spend that extended retirement period, the longest ever retirement period in history, without working. So people will be working for much longer. We'll have an older labour force. But whilst people are working for longer, they're also suffering from more chronic lifestyle-related diseases, such as mental illness, substance abuse, and obesity. So the people in that workforce will have more issues that need to be managed and supported. And then we're increasingly relying on migrant labour to make up the skills gaps in our labour force. So it's going to be a much more diverse workforce, and that's going to require different kinds of management approaches. It's also a workforce that has shifted from what used to be much more manufacturing kind of work, where we delivered a tangible product, to an environment where many of us are working in the services sector. Now we're delivering something much more intangible. And that's going to continue to be the major employer in Australia, as because of this ageing population, which creates demand for healthcare and for aged care and for social services, but also because of all that technology disruption, which means that people need to keep upskilling and reskilling, and therefore means we'll need more educators and trainers. And we're also seeing organisations whose value proposition is far more intangible. Think about Airbnb, the world's largest provider of accommodation services, which doesn't own a single hotel. And then our final trend is this rising bar for qualification and getting into the workforce. Around the world, levels of education have been rising, and we're now at a point where China and India will soon be the major source of PhD qualified workers around the world. And so there's all these effects playing out which change the way in which we work. And what I want to start looking at in the second part of this presentation is what those broad trends mean for the types of skills that are going to be needed more in the workforce. And I'm only going to provide a very broad overview of this, and I think the people from Burning Glass will be able to provide much more fine-grained information. But here's how it's been playing out in the Australian workforce. What we're seeing here is the profile of the Australian labour force, where occupations are classified according to skill levels. Back in 1986, the blue line was the largest occupational group. This is skill level 4, relatively low level of skill. To work in a skill level 4 job, you only need a certificate 2 or a certificate 3. This is the kind of job where you might be a barista, an aged care provider, or a truck driver. What you can see is since 1986, that dark blue line has been overtaken by the aqua line. And what's fascinating about this is that aqua line is actually the very highest skill level. So we've shifted from being a labour force where most of us were about certificate 2, certificate 3, to where most people, or the largest group of people, I should say, need a degree or an advanced diploma in order to find a job. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because the more we rely on technology to deliver our goods and services, the more we are automating the very routine, simpler kinds of work. And therefore, the work that remains for the human worker is increasingly complex. And this requires that we have higher levels of education in order to deliver our work. Maybe you all knew that already. And really the key question here is, what kinds of high skills do we need? And in an effort to answer that question, what we did was we linked Australian labour force data with some very rich data that comes out of the United States Department of Labour. They surveyed experts, human resources managers, across all the different sectors of the economy. And they asked them to say, for each of the occupations they managed, what types of skills and aptitudes were needed in those jobs. And we were able to match that data back to more than 300 of the occupations in the Australian labour force. So now we can see, as the composition of the labour force has changed over time, what kinds of skills are needed in those growing occupations. And for simplicity, we categorise them into 3 types. We have STEM skills, the science, technology, engineering and math skills. We have more communication skills like writing, active listening, negotiation, presentation skills. And then we have technical skills like being able to repair machinery or install equipment. And here's what we found. Despite all the rhetoric about the importance of STEM skills, the skills that are actually growing fastest in demand are the communication skills. That is partly because we're working in the services sector. So we're dealing with people, and that means we need strong people skills. But it's also, again, because of this impact of technology. Because whilst technology can take over the routine and rule-based aspects of a job, it can't yet, and probably won't for the medium term, be able to build a relationship with someone, make them feel understood, demonstrate empathy, help somebody take a really complex, ill-defined problem and come up with the right solution and make them feel that's the right solution. And these are the skills that are needed more and more in our workforce. And the STEM skills one is interesting. Obviously, it's still growing in demand, but certain types of STEM skills are more important than others. What you can see is the science skills, things like physics and biology, are showing very low rates of growth. What is growing in demand is what we're calling more generic types of STEM skills. Things like the ability to use computers, mathematics, or the ability to work with numbers. Technology design, so being able to use technology to solve a problem. So the message here is we need to be able to work with technology and numbers, but we don't all need to become programmers. Now, this tells us how the labour force and demand for skills has shifted over time so far. We have also attempted to look forwards into the future, begin to estimate how future developments in technology might affect demand for skills. And here, this rather complex graph shows you the 16 largest occupations for female on the left and male workers on the right. And really all you need to concentrate on here are the bars, and the fact that the bars are high in some jobs and low in others. So the first job, sales assistants, is the largest occupational category in the Australian labour force for both men and women. And for this job, the bar is high. There is, according to our estimates, about 80% chance of this type of work being automated in the near term. And yet the second role is the second largest group, and that bar is very low, because for school teachers, the technology does not replace you. The technology enables you to do your job better. So a teacher can use online content to explain core material, which that student can revisit over time if they need to, and meanwhile the teacher can spend more time one-on-one. Or the teacher can begin to help the students understand how to apply that core content to solve a complex problem. And they can use the performance data that they get from that online material on a student's progress and level of engagement to provide much more personalised support. So my message here is that technology can displace workers in some roles, and yet in other roles it can make the human worker much more efficient, more productive, and potentially generate much higher salaries. So here is what I think the key messages from all of this are. Yes, technology is on its way, and it will require us to get better at managing transitions. Some of us will have to find new kinds of job. Many of us will have to learn to do our job in new ways as we use technology more and more. But exactly how this will all play out is hard to predict. We have social choices rather than technological destinies. Our choices are around things like how we regulate the use of technology, which kind of technology we adopt and which we don't, what kind of infrastructure investments we make. As an individual, I think the key choice for us is around whether or not we take a passive stance towards this oncoming wave of technology or whether we take a much more active stance. And what I mean by this is we don't want to feel threatened by digital technology and just wait to see what happens. What we need to do is constantly stay engaged and explore how we can use technology in our lives and in our work to do our job better, to add value for a customer in a new way, or to make the world a better place. So that's my key message for us all. Thank you.
Okie doke. So our next speaker is Matt Sigelman. So Matt is the CEO of the international data analytics company, Burning Glass, and he's a global speaker on future workforce, reskilling and transition. Matt most recently presented his company's findings to the World Economic Forum earlier this year at Davos, and this also received quite a bit of media attention. So Matt has jumped off a plane from Boston this morning, I believe. He's already spoken at another event today and he's heading off to Canberra in the evening for something else. So it's really, really great to have him here. So let's give him a big hand.
Thank you so much. I have never actually fallen asleep while speaking before, so I have put people to sleep for sure. My wife says that I'm very talented at being able to eat while sleeping, but we'll test that out. What I wanted to do was to build on a couple of the really powerful findings that Claire just shared. And it turns out these postcards, by the way, are great for taking notes. There's a little white space around the corners. A few things in particular jumped out at me and things where I want to sort of get into a little bit more detail. One of the things, of course, one of the starting points in Claire's presentation was the potential for significant disruption associated with automation, and Claire shared the statistics we often hear, sort of at 9 to 47% of the kind of activities that workers do today having potential to be automated away. And so therefore the changing nature of jobs that's likely to be in the future. Claire also talked about how that connects directly with the need not for a less but a more skilled workforce in the future. And then finally the need for workers and learners to be able to take the steps that are needed to figure out how to make themselves more valuable and to offer more value to the market. And so I want to build on all of those points, which I think so eloquently Claire laid out. We're lucky at Burning Glass to have a unique vantage point on the job market and to see many of the kind of changes that are already starting to happen in terms of the future of work play out. For us, our sandbox is we collect millions of job postings every day on the one side, and we touch hundreds of millions of people's resumes a year. And we do a lot of the heavy lifting, the natural language processing and so forth, to be able to translate those jobs into a common language so that we can actually hear specifically how jobs are changing at a level of granularity. It's a little different from how we've tended to understand things. And across the millions of jobs that we see every year, one of the things that has stood out so clearly for us is that when you look at the job market, not at the level of jobs, but lies underneath jobs, you realize that jobs have a genome. In fact, the term job market itself may well be a misnomer, not only because it doesn't operate as a single job market, but also because that market is driven much more by skills than it is by jobs, and skills in turn are the key to unlocking value for workers and learners and for ensuring that Australian enterprise has the skills that it needs for the decades to come. Let me explain how that bears out. When we start to actually decompose jobs in terms of the skills that employers are asking for, not that we think that they need, but which Australian employers are asking for, which those jobs have defined themselves as throughout the world. One of the things that we see, one of the most powerful trends that we've seen, is that jobs are starting to blend those genomes. They're starting to blend skill sets in ways that make them look entirely alien in a lot of ways. Essentially, jobs are having sex. Just put as a contrast point here, a traditional genome job, right, a welding job. You can imagine they're pretty monoclonal in terms of that genome, right? Mostly a welding job needs welding skills. Those kinds of jobs are growing, but not very fast. Overall, welders, for example, have grown 15% over the last 5 years. By contrast, look at a data science job and all the different sets of skills that are needed to do that job. Data scientists need, on the one hand, they need to have programming skills, but they need as well data skills, they need presentation skills, they need business skills. So you're seeing that kind of broad mix of skills. And those are often skills that are increasingly orthogonal in terms of how they're defined. Let me give you an example of coding skills, which is one of those sets of skills that's broadly hybridizing the workforce. To Claire's point, coding jobs themselves may or may not be relevant. People often say, oh, well, shouldn't everyone become a developer? Well, in fact, there's a lot of evidence that maybe software jobs themselves, as technology becomes more accessible, may get significantly automated. On the other hand, what we see is that those skill sets become increasingly relevant to a broad array of jobs. What we've done here is taken the universe of occupations, arrayed them in earning quartiles, and what you find is that top earning quartile jobs spot on half are in occupations that are now asking increasingly for coding skills. To be clear, that's not saying that half of all top earning jobs are in software or are dev jobs. These are jobs in marketing, in finance, in life sciences that ask you to be able to code in order to do your job. Give you another example here, the world of data science, right? We all heard this explosion of demand for data. We're here being hosted very graciously by the folks from Data61, which is dedicated to being able to apply data, to being able to understand an array of problems. And we see that borne out across the market. This is from an analysis that we did with IBM and PwC of the world of data science and analytics jobs. And what you'll see here is that on the one hand, data science jobs themselves are growing super fast. They're super important. But when you array the world of data analytics jobs that ask for data analytics skills as opposed to jobs that are called data scientists, and see what jobs are they that ask for those skills. You can look at, on the one side, how fast are those jobs growing, and the other, how much employment do they represent. The key here is that you've got a pot of jobs that are growing super fast, and those are the ones that call themselves data science. But notice they hover pretty close to the y-axis here. In other words, they're not representing huge numbers of jobs. On the other hand, the much bigger cloud to the right, sorry, this is a little hard to read, are jobs like marketing managers and finance managers and an array of others, which aren't data jobs. They're the jobs that we're all used to talking about, the jobs that we know people who do those jobs. But increasingly, the skills that they learned are not going to be the skills, are not alone going to be the skills that they need to do those jobs in the future. And so people are going to need a mechanism for acquiring those new skills. This is not just the province of a set of jobs in Silicon Valley. This is stuff that we're seeing borne out the world over. Right? 113,000 jobs. This was, I think, data from a report we did in 2015, even more today. Here in Australia, just in the course of 12 months, that needed data analytics skills, growing well faster than the job market. And overall, when you sort of look at data science as just an example of jobs that are hybridizing, come up with metrics to figure out to what extent various jobs are asking for sets of skills that essentially represent different hats that don't normally get worn on the same head. And when you look at those jobs that are most hybridized, they are the jobs that are growing well faster than average, and they are also the jobs that are paying the best across any segment of work, and they're the jobs that are most valuable to employers and least vulnerable to automation. Playing out, again, the world around. So not only is Australia seeing that same growth in demand for data science and analytics jobs, but we're seeing the same in terms of hybridization overall, huge growth in the number of jobs that are blending sets of skills in ways that don't necessarily align with traditional higher education structures. And here's just another good example of mobile app developers. Sounds like a pretty standard job as a developer, right? But mobile app developers, and I think I pulled this example purposely because in some ways is a great example. Developer, yes, they need to have programming skills, but relative to developers, just web developers or other software engineers, mobile app developers are much more likely to be called on to other sets of skills. They often need marketing and business skills because they're developing commerce applications. They're often called on to have design skills because they're developing applications for consumers, and a host of others. And so you can sort of see that trend accelerating. Here again, I want to build on a point that Claire made so powerfully about communication skills. As routine tasks get automated, people are being asked to bridge across and to synthesize different sets of skills, to bring different sets of skills to bear. And so on the one hand, people are being asked to be more specialized, to have more technical skills. But in order to actualize those technical skills, they're being asked to have more foundational skills. Here again, use the example of data science jobs. This is true across hybridization. Data science jobs are significantly more likely, almost 50% more likely, not less, to ask for creativity skills. They are 50% more likely, not less, to ask for teamwork skills, 50% more likely to ask for problem solving, well more likely to ask for writing and research skills. So what we're seeing is that as jobs become more valuable, as they become more tech-enabled, more data-enabled, they become more human. And they become less vulnerable to automation because that which is human is harder and harder for a machine to copy. Now, thus far, we've been talking about some pretty professional jobs. Data science, mobile app developers, marketing managers, and so forth. This same trend is bearing out across the job market. It's certainly bearing out in the world of middle skill jobs. I'm not sure if that term translates in the Southern Hemisphere. We think of middle skill jobs as being north of secondary education, south of a university degree. And in those jobs, full-on 8 and 10 are what we measure digitally intensive when we actually look at what are those jobs asking for workers to bring with them. Those jobs that are digitally intensive among middle skill jobs are twice as likely to pay a living wage, and they're growing twice as fast. So again, we are looking for sets of skills that we haven't necessarily trained. And as we think about the challenge to creating an education structure, an education system that links up, one of the other challenges becomes the dynamism of that market. Again, we talked about the rapid growth in demand here in Australia and elsewhere for data science jobs. So about 25,000 Australian postings in the last year asked for what I'll call sort of heavy data skills. That's a threefold increase. When you think about that in the scope of labor market economics, right, where most jobs grow a couple % a year, a threefold increase in 5 years is a huge growth. But in that same time period, even if you had that crystal ball and you were a uni and you created those degree programs, the genome of those jobs has changed even faster. So while those jobs were going up threefold, demand for data visualization skills has gone up 36-fold. In some of the core big data infrastructure skills like Hadoop have grown 21-fold. Machine learning skills within those jobs going up 13-fold. So that raises an important set of questions around how we can create a system that can keep up, that can make sure that we have opportunities for workers and learners going forward. And it also raises the question, when you think about a market that's that dynamic, that blends skills that fast, as to how we can make sure people have the mechanism and the infrastructure and the market map to know how to acquire skills on the fly. So with that in mind, I want to talk about that opportunity. And I want to talk about that opportunity in terms of how we can structure learning to enable workers to make more efficient transition in order to enable both individual workers and how we can figure out how to solve mismatch issues, market inefficiencies at scale. And a core notion to that, which will take us to the work we did on reskilling for the World Economic Forum, is the notion of arbitrage. We all know about arbitrage, buy low, sell high. It seems strangely inappropriate when talking about how you can help people skill themselves up. And yet here it is. There exists, when you can actually get down to a more granular view of the market, turns out there are skills that are easily acquirable that give people significantly more value, very immediate returns, and very immediate opportunities to improve, to transition both within the jobs they have and to transition across jobs to ones that may be less automation vulnerable. Let me give you an example. A logistics manager makes, on average in Australia, $70,000 a year. A logistics manager who's got data skills, who can analyze traffic patterns or order patterns and the like, makes $100,000 a year. It does not cost $30,000 to learn SQL. Learning is the unique opportunity that people have to arbitrage in themselves. It is the unique opportunity that governments have and others in the policy-making spectrum, universities, and others, to help affect that arbitrage, to take talent and make it more valuable to the economy and to themselves. Give you some other examples, both of how this works within job areas. So, for example, a journalist who makes in the U.S. $36,000 becoming a technical writer makes $59,000. There's just a few sets of skills they need to pick up in order to affect that transition. Whether it's the admin, the administrative assistant, who learns Salesforce.com skills and acquires an $8,000 pay premium. But it also represents how we can start to think about automation, not as just a panic, not as just a train wreck, and we all hear 50% of jobs are going away or whatever. That may be true, it may not be true. But regardless of how many jobs will be lost, and we know there will be some, the ability to be able to identify very efficient training and learning paths that are based upon the skill genome of the jobs, of the talent that's being displaced, and adjacent genomes that are in high demand, that are hard to fill, and be able to identify the gaps across. One example of the kind of skill that can broadly affect an array of workers is supervisory skills. A food service worker who acquires management skills can make a $10,000 a year wage premium, which at that level of work is life-changing. Right? And here's an example of that kind of map of how somebody can make a series of jumps and over time significantly improve her lot. Here's a problem. So I mentioned that those skills are in some way sort of a golden gateway to mobility for workers across the spectrum. But at the same time, we have a signal processing problem in the market. And in some cases, we are sending faulty signals. Increasingly, supervisory roles are closed off to workers even in fields that should be middle skill jobs. 44% of production managers, manager of job postings, actually ask for a university degree. 47% of transportation managers, 82% of construction managers are being asked for a university degree. So we think about how we can affect those pathways. We can see what the skills are, but we need to make sure that employers are signaling in ways that don't create market inefficiency. So that gets us back to the question of how we can apply this notion of arbitrage to helping workers survive automation. I mentioned a minute ago the report we did on reskilling, toward a reskilling revolution for the World Economic Forum. And it started with this notion of let's take automation as a given and let's figure out how to identify job and career adjacencies. Workers who, without training, whose jobs are in high automation risk fields, in most cases have very few options for mobility, and most of those options are negative options. They pay less, and often significantly so. It turns out, though, that for every one of those, for 96%, I shouldn't say every one, but for 96% of high automation risk jobs, there are adjacent jobs which pay better and in a lot of cases, a significant array. In fact, without retraining, most jobs have, only a few % of people have 20 options. With effective and efficient retraining infrastructure and all the policy support that's required around how we support people to get those skills, the average worker has 20 options. And instead of those options being negative options, the average person has an opportunity to increase their income by about $15,000 a year. So that's the kind of scope of change. And just to illustrate that, Claire was talking before about shop assistants, retail assistants, and I think any discussion of reskilling that doesn't start with retail is missing a lot of the power to put this into effect. So let's use that as an example. We looked at, first off, the resumes of people who started off in retail and saw where they went. And we found that people who were able to transition out of retail were more than twice as likely to be in a job with low automation risk, and they were more than 40% likely, or 40% more likely, rather, to be in a better paying job. And just to put better paying in context, better paying means making at least 30% more, not a couple of, little bit. Here's how that works. You look then at what are the paths that people took out of retail. Now, I've highlighted in orange a set of pathways that represent significant underexploited opportunity, whether it be moving into various kinds of sales jobs, whether even it be moving into IT. These are jobs with much lower automation risk and which pay much better. Now, IT may sound improbable, right, for a retail assistant. Let me give you this example. I work in a big box retailer selling, let's say, consumer appliances. I move from there to selling consumer electronics. I move from there to repairing and setting up people's consumer electronics. I move from there to doing an entry-level IT help desk job. Each of those steps is just a few skills away from the one before it. And yet each of those steps unlocks opportunity in ways that we're not thinking about before. Here's just another example of looking at the genome of a retail worker versus a retail banking worker. And the latter, of course, is much more mobility and also better pay. We can apply the same notion to the world of education as well, both in terms of its structure and how we can think about more efficient structures for education, but also in terms of how we can improve the prospects for graduates. Here's an example of an MBA. Now, it turns out that if you look at jobs that ask for an MBA, and then you unpack some of the skills that an MBA should presumably be teaching you, it turns out there's a whole array of MBA skills, some of which I've put here, whether it be project management skills, whether it be product development skills, whether it be strategic leadership, each of which pays better than the MBA itself. In other words, the MBA is worth less than the sum of its parts. Now, my point here is not to just pick on MBAs. I happen to have one. Whether it helped me is another question. But my point here is to point out that there may be ways for us to unpack those skills and to enable learners to acquire those skills over time and stack them over time into degrees. Because as we saw on an earlier slide, degrees do still matter. But we have ways of enabling people to acquire and realize value much faster than the very significant deferred gratification exercise that a typical degree represents and the very significant expense that a bundle of skills that's called a degree represents. The same thing works in reverse as well. We look at the prospects of graduates. It turns out if you look at particularly on the one hand, this is a white-hot economy here in Australia, and to a lesser extent, the world around. And yet we have many graduates, particularly those with arts degrees, humanities degrees, what we call liberal arts in the States, who come out and have trouble finding full-time work, who have trouble finding work in their field, or that really is the kind of work that required a university degree to begin with. It turns out that when you strip the job market down to just those jobs that ask for a university degree, and then you work back up and say, if I just add in sets of skills that could be acquired fairly easily on the peripheries of one of those degrees, how many more jobs does it unlock? It turns out it doubles the number of jobs that are open to those with arts or general degrees. And those incremental jobs pay significantly more. Things like graphic design jobs unlock thousands of additional jobs and a significant wage premium. It doesn't take that much to learn the Adobe suite. The same thing as well can be a powerful way of rethinking diversity and of ensuring that we can actually have a more equitable job market. We were talking before about mobile app developers, so let's run with that example. Mobile app developers are, in the US, 9% women. I imagine the percentage is not significantly different here. It's worth noting that even though it's not the same job, web designers are 52% women. Now, they're not the same job. If you look at the skills underneath those, they ask for somewhat different skills. But it's a relatively short hop, so to speak, from being a web designer to being a web developer. That's trainable. It's a discrete skill delta, if you will, between the two. And it's a relatively short hop from being a web developer to being a mobile app developer. You go from 52% women to 20% women to 9% women, from $60,000 a year to about $80,000 or $90,000 a year to $120,000 a year. The opportunity, on the one hand, to increase the diversity of the workforce, to increase equity, and to increase value to workers is really significant. To make this work, though, we need to be able to democratize access. All of this hinges on people having the information they need to make smart decisions, be able to understand where opportunity lies, and it depends as well on having a skill development ecosystem, whether through Australia's universities, through its TAFEs, through online learning, that speaks the same language as the job market, and that offers bundles that are more efficiently titrated to worker transition. I'm looking forward to the rest of our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wow, that was great, Matt. Thanks very much. And I think there were a lot of common threads from what Claire picked up at the start to what Matt really got into some of the detail. And our next speaker, Paul, actually is going to continue on in that thread. Let me introduce Paul, for those of you who don't know him. So Paul's actually our data lead for Ribit. He's an adjunct professor, and he's also the author of a book called Online Gravity. He did a world tour for that last year, and that looks at all the latest trends affecting the global economy. So today he'll be talking about skills, as the other speakers have been talking about, and the workplace from the perspective of innovative companies. We at Ribit have done some really interesting data work on that, and so he'll be sharing some of the insights from that. And then after Paul, we'll be going directly into Q&A. So let's welcome Paul.
Thanks very much, Liz. I'll just step down here. I'm going to grab a copy of my book so I can show that off. Okay. So, wow, what a fantastic couple of presentations. That was amazing. I've never heard sexual selection used in the career marketplace before, but I love it. You know, it's such a brilliant idea, this idea of, you know, the genome of the job and decomposition, you know, and I think that idea on both the job side and also on the training side, you know, they say there's only two true business models. You can either disaggregate things or you can reaggregate things, and you know, it's being able to see things by disaggregation in such a way is, you know, fabulous. So we've called this talk Joey Discovery, and I'll explain why it's called that in a minute. Just a bit of background. As Liz said, I'm working here with the team, Data61, CSIRO, Liz's team. I've also I've worked in fintech, media tech, and I'm currently chair of a new startup media tech hub in Sydney, Australia's first, called The Studio. For anyone's interested, wants to ask me about that later. I wrote a book called Online Gravity, which has been published by Simon & Schuster. It's about basically how I believe that technology has changed economics and what are the consequences of that. And it's sold out in Australia. It's been a bestseller in India, and I'm delighted to say that CITIC are publishing in Chinese this month, or in this month being April. Unconventional data. So we're called Data61. Many people here are into data. What's unconventional data? It's this idea of this torrent of new data that's emerged that's non-traditional as a result of the web, largely, through three main sources. Our own interactions with the web through things like social media services, websites, automated services, through transaction, and that's the sort of traditional exhaust data from retail transactions, from stock exchange trades, paying bills and so on, and the automation data. So that's Internet of Things and machine data, aerial photography, that sort of thing, in some of the sources here. Unconventional data can shed new insights on all sorts of things, including the labour market. This is some work that our colleague Matthew Sigelman, who was with Data61, is now at MIT, did in Spain. He used Twitter data and showed the efficacy of using Twitter data at a national scale. This is 20 million tweets across Spain, looking at people's, they were anonymised, and then they looked at their mobility, their diurnal rhythms, so what time they got up in the morning, and they also did linguistic analysis on their language to try and understand how well they expressed themselves. And then they found some trends. But probably the main takeaway here was that it was it's a new useful view into this market. I think one of the key findings was that people who were mobile or willing to be mobile were more employable. Perhaps not surprising. Some work we're doing, it's a bit early to talk about this yet, but it's very exciting. We're working with Peggy Kern, University of Melbourne, fantastic researcher there, and another colleague, Marianne Andre Razou at ANU, and some great students we've got working around using social media, unconventional data to look at vocation. That idea of, you know, are we in the right job? Was there a job that you were thwarted at, you know, early on in your career, you know, this idea of a calling. I love this photo. I just found it on the web, but she's an elementary school librarian and someone who was obviously very inspired by her and has obviously found the right career for her. I guess I'm interested in this idea of career alignment and whether or not, you know, if you change jobs, whether that would lead to overall labour market efficiency and, more importantly, for you, make a better job. We're also looking at companies, and this is really the focus of today's talk, is the other side of the market. It's around employers. This is some work we've done with the New South Wales government, and we're looking at emerging industries. So what are the industries of tomorrow? This is the environmental goods and services industries, and we're using machine learning to cluster companies that are in this. It's sort of like it doesn't really have a clear industry category at the moment. So they're in engineering, they're in recycling, there's new companies creating new products for this. But this is clustering them on functions. So you can see similarity between companies, and potentially if you're a company in this space, you can see other actors in a supply chain that could be very useful, both to you as a company, but more importantly, broadly to the industry. question is demand or supply. So I sort of was thinking about this. We hear a lot about reskilling, and I think that's really useful. And the practical tools, that Matt and his team at Burning Glass are doing about how do you transition to new growing jobs is fabulous thing. But there's the other side, there's the demand side, the company side too. This is a graph from OECD data that shows graduate employment outcomes. In Australia, unlike our peers in Europe, they've been going in the wrong direction for the last 10 years. We have some of the worst graduate employment outcomes, despite the fact that we've got a resilient economy and 20 years of unbroken growth, as you say. But as Lisa Kahn's work at Yale has clearly demonstrated, the economy does have an effect. If you don't have if you might have the wrong skills, but if the economy's in a dip, that's not going to help. The other side of the equation is very important. And Lisa's amazing work demonstrated that those people unfortunate enough to graduate during a recession have lifetime impacts on their own income, up to 20% less. So this is just demonstrating the demand side is very important too. Also, there's been some calls in the higher education circles in Australia that perhaps we have too many graduates. We've democratised education, which is clearly a fantastic thing, and that perhaps we should be encouraging people to have other career pathways in vet and elsewhere. The data would suggest that's not the case if you want a high salary, and I think that was borne out through Claire and Matt's presentation too, that in fact higher qualifications lead to higher salaries. This is, we were kindly given a sample of Burning Glass's amazing data from last year to just have a quick look at, and we looked at the PhDs advertised for in the Australian market during 1 month last year. There's a very, very large number of jobs in the total cohort, but it would suggest at face value that Australian employers aren't looking to employ PhDs. 1%. So that's quite a disappointing result, but then our colleagues in Canberra at ANU, Hannah Sugelman and others, have done some really interesting work where they're using natural language processing to look at the knowledge intensity of jobs based on the language used in the job ads. They worked with SEEK and they analysed a year's worth of job ads in Australia, a very large set of data, and they measured the knowledge intensity of jobs, and they found that 5 times those advertised with the calling specifically for PhDs were actually PhD-shaped jobs. In other words, they were suitable for PhDs. So that would suggest that it could be an information or a signalling problem, as it is, And I like this idea that that there could be a lot of information inefficiencies in this marketplace. It's a very sort of economic sort of view of the market. On the demand side, of course, the key thing is growth. Companies that are growing employ people. So how do we get more growth companies? Well, clearly, the digital economy means our companies operating at a global scale. They're using digital platforms. I talk about this in my book, where you can leverage distribution and supply platforms to create companies like WhatsApp that connected 500 million people, created $18 billion of value with only 55 staff. And how did they do that? Well, they did it on the back of Apple, basically, on a distribution, a global platform being Apple. And that's this metaphor of the planets. So there are only 8 planets in our solar system due to the forces of gravity, and I would argue there's only 8 gravity giants in a similar sort of way. So the other last thing is knowledge intensity. So this is an article I wrote for Fast Company last year, which looks at unconventional data. That's a satellite photo that some of these really advanced quant funds in New York and London are using amongst a bunch of other unconventional signals to understand the prospects of traded listed companies and doing sort of Warren Buffett using machine learning, basically. And Winton and 2 Sigma employ an enormous amount of PhDs. Winton was in fact founded by physicists, Cambridge physicists, and they're this new generation of quant firms that are very smart and data-centric. So what we're interested in is identifying these companies. So we did a quick study last year of ASX 200. So they're the largest companies on the Australian Securities Exchange. We looked at data from traditional sources and then linking that to non-traditional sources, such as social media. This is a traditional source. This is a Data61 product. It's called the National Map. It's a platform it's an open data platform. Anyone can use it. You can just drag and drop data onto it in Excel format, and you get these beautiful choropleths or heat maps. Then we're clustered by industry, so you can't compare, a digital advertising firm clearly has more digital potential and maturity than a utilities firm, but comparing peers with peers, we ranked their digital maturity, all the largest companies on the Australian Securities Exchange. Then we did this thing where we used machine learning to cluster them according to the technologies that they use. We found 7 distinct clusters, from people that are using traditional servers in their basement to those using cloud infrastructure, A/B testing and all these new types of technologies. And so the people using the contemporary technology outperformed those that were using the more mature technologies by a significant margin. And these were across industries. So this is not tech companies versus non-tech companies. This is paint companies who are digitally savvy and smart versus IT companies that don't have a clue. So there's a mix of companies from all sorts of industries, but it's around digital maturity and using machine learning and clustering. So Joeys, the word Joeys comes from this idea that there's a borrowing from a European term, gazelles, which are high-growth firms, young high-growth firms, where research both the UK, Europe, US and Australia all demonstrate that a small number of firms account for most of the net new jobs created. We're calling them Joeys. There was, how can we help find them so that students can find them, so they can find jobs with them. So the Joey 500, we want to find 500 high-growth companies in this sort of category. This was one that we met through one of Ribit's speed dating events in Melbourne, the MedTech event. Fabulous company. They do medical devices. This is a digital stethoscope for kids. 5 million investment from Tencent, which is, most of you all know, is kind of like the Facebook of China. And really high growth company. What a wonderful company to work for, but who's heard of them? So how do you find companies like this? And where are these Joeys? So we want to sort of explore unconventional data to discover these companies for the benefit of students and others. The findings of this work have been published in the Australian Innovation Systems Report, which was published by the federal government last December. So if you want to have a look at that, you can. This is a quick summary of what we did. We looked at the digital potential and customer growth of companies using unconventional data. We did some machine learning cluster using the technologies that they used as revealed through their websites. And we found that growth technology basket users outperformed those. This is in terms of headcount growth we're looking at in this case. The previous one was total shareholder return. And we found some exemplar businesses. Some of you may know these. MathSpace in Sydney has doubled its staff in the last 2 years. Fabulous company, online education. Zip Money, now ASX listed, acquired Pocketbook, who've hired a lot of students through Ribit, so we know firsthand they're doing really well. And Autopilot, who've expanded into the US recently, a marketing automation company that's going gangbusters. So this is what we've done. We've sort of taken a few signals and looked at various aspects of company performance, and moving forward we're going to expand that to the stack. This is if you like the company stack, various aspects of functional performance, various other unconventional data sources. So some observations on long-term, coming back to the sexual selection metaphor, I thought I just stumbled upon this research and I thought it was fascinating. It's some social research that looks at data on how online dating has changing society, basically, in the US it is. It's now the number 2 way of meeting people, I think, in most communities in the US, and it's growing racial diversity, lowering divorce rates, and increasing marital satisfaction. So if anyone complains about the web, you can say, well, it's doing all these amazing things, and that you can see that now. It's having such a big dramatic. What would happen? What's going to happen in the employment marketplace? I guess I'm wondering, with these new kind of services. better information markets for employment. One of the things we're kind of mindful of at Ribit is diversity. Liz held this breakfast here the other day, a Women's Day breakfast, brilliant event with lots of early career and student women and mentoring, because there are, as we know, these juncture points in various careers where, there's a difficulty in transitioning from university to the professional world. Looking also at the talent signatures, as I think of them in terms of the digital platform companies. In my book, I looked at IBM versus a platform company, so Apple, for example, and found that Apple employs a lot more, surprising number of creative arts, visual arts people. So it's a product company, and it's quite an interesting thing, I think, to look at that. And I think you're going to see these trends. Amazon employs a lot of economists because it's an economy, basically. So, novel data and platforms means actionable insights. That's what we're about at Data61. This is one of our colleagues' work, Cecile Paris. This is breathtaking. If you've got one thing to look up afterwards and you haven't seen this, go and look it up. It's called We Feel, and it takes tweets from around the world in real time, and it does sentiment analysis on them. So it works out sort of what the kind of tone of the language is, basically, and it works out whether people are angry or sad or happy or joyful, and it does very sort of subtle categorisation in time and space. So basically it's a map of the zeitgeist of the vibe thing, the feeling everywhere in the world. And that picture we're looking at now, I did that earlier today, that's a look at compassion in this part of the world. And as you can see, the last 14 days there's been 152 tweets related to compassion. You can imagine you can correlate this to all sorts of other things and the kind of things we can learn by connecting different types of data sets. This is unconventional data on steroids, this one. This is some work we've done. Colin Griffith, who's here, one in our team, which is the business graph. It's looking at connecting and identifying businesses, working with some of the growth centres in various industries. This one's food, and we're looking at how do we better understand the dynamics and of businesses within various industries and make them more visible to each other. And then lastly, of course, the Ribit platform itself, which is a national platform to connect students, both undergraduate, postgraduate, to exciting opportunities at growth companies and innovative companies. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, that was the third excellent speech from our speakers. I thought that was really fascinating, and everyone tweeted it a little bit differently, so I'm sure you all agree with me that it was a really insightful presentation from all speakers. So, yeah, let's just give them all a big hand again. Thanks. Okay, so the next session, the next session of this is Q&A. What I'll do is invite Matt and Claire up to the stage here, and I'll just give a bit of a description around what we're doing here. So if anyone wants to leave, has to leave now, please do so. This will go for about, what are we, 20 minutes? 15 to 20 minutes. Then afterwards we've got pizza, wine and beer next door, gluten-free for those that want that. Yeah, so please hang around and join us for that. So the rules around the Q&A are obviously, respectfulness and everything that everyone knows here. There's no shy people in this audience that I can see, or maybe some, but please, you're all welcome to ask questions. Can I just ask if you limit your question to no more than 15 seconds? Obviously, everyone here. And just to summarise some of the discussion that we had for everyone. So we basically had discussion around common and uncommon data themes amongst the speakers. We heard about strong STEM and not so strong STEM and intangibles and tangibles from Claire. We heard about the growth of peer-to-peer platforms, online dating and the hybridisation of skills, or as Matt was talking about, the sexual genome of new jobs, building skills on existing skill sets, and how to discover Joey's hiding in the scrub, go bush bashing with Paul McCarthy, and find your next mutant kangaroo unicorn. Right? Okay, so would someone like to ask a question? Or shall I start with the Dixer? Yep. Okay, so look, what I might do is just start by asking the panel, if you were an 18-year-old tertiary student studying this year, what would you do and why?
Oh, thanks, Liz. Yeah, I think I'd follow. I went and visited a professor at Sydney Uni. She's an economist, and she had 4 kids now grown up, and she said, I gave my own kids the wrong advice, which was keep your head down and study. And the first one was all right. He was a lawyer, and he was just sort of had a bit of good luck. But she said by the time the 4th, her daughter got through, she was doing architecture, and she said, long degree, got to the end of it, and she said the job thing was go to a cocktail party, with 20 other graduates and one job. And that was it. And so she said she really struggled, and she's now sort of changed her view. So my advice would be, as it has been to my kids, get a job. But don't wait, start straight away, like first year uni. So, yeah.
Definitely pro getting a job. Which one matters a lot? And that's true at all stages. So it turns out, for example, that university graduates' first job has a huge impact in terms of their ongoing success. You shared data from Lisa Kahn. We've been looking more recently at, and for the paper that's going to come out next month, on underemployment of university graduates. And we find that if you are underemployed, i.e. you wind up in a job that's sort of the barista, if you will, with the anthropology degree or whoever you are, we often tend to sort of think of it as, well, go and experience life and get a job and work. That explains a great deal of lifetime underemployment. So people who are underemployed initially have a much harder time climbing above that underemployment. It specifically explains a lot of the lifetime underperformance of women in the job market. We're used to sort of this canard of why, women make 80 cents on the dollar or whatever it is because they get off the track for family concerns or whatever. It turns out that women's underperformance in the job market actually starts with initial underemployment. Women are much more likely to be underemployed coming out, and when they are less likely to have family concerns or issues that they're addressing. And so which job you take matters. So I think that gets back to your question of how do you figure out what that is. I think I would recommend to a tertiary graduate a couple of things. First of all, it's really important to think about not only what jobs are in demand and how much that job will pay, but to think one beyond it. I'll give you an example. And again, I apologize if this example doesn't translate so well. But let's take the example of 2 jobs that will be open to typically sort of tertiary education graduates, TAFE graduates or the like. One might be to get a job as a pharmacy technician. Another might be to get a job as a salesperson in a retail bank, what we call personal banker. They both pay about the same, and they both are relatively similar amounts of training that you need to get those jobs. Where do you go from being a farm tech? Right? You're not going to become a pharmacist ever. Hospital dispensaries are already increasingly automated. So On the other hand, you can look at that job as I can start making the same amount of money working in a retail bank branch, and then there's sets of jobs that go after. So I'd make sure that people are looking not just at where they land to start, but where their next opportunities may be.
I've been asked to ask people online if you could please mute your microphone at your end, because we're getting a bit of feedback. So my answer, I think the big takeaway from Matt's talk for me, and something that resonates a lot with what I've heard from many others, is the need for much more efficient education. I think this trend of people investing more and more years in a classroom rather than in the workplace is something we have to arrest, and that we need to understand the skills that people are acquiring in the workplace, start packaging our education much more efficiently so that we're building on the specific skill sets that are needed to make transitions rather than doing whole years of education, during which time some of what you learnt in that degree was outdated, became outdated. So for me, that's the big message, is don't get locked away for a long time in a classroom just doing an MBA without understanding why you are learning what you are learning and where you'll go with it.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. Okay, we got a question. Ryan.
I have a question. I'm kind of curious, with all of the focus on skills and also comments around changing how we do education and other things. I'd be really kind of curious on the panelists' thoughts on how we actually, what the risk is between losing education versus training. And in the same way that we're talking, people in the research talk about, foundational research versus the application of that research. I wonder if this whole approach to skills and the job market risks people losing some of those fundamental education opportunities and having a preference for specific trainable skills.
So I'm glad you asked the question, because it is, we have tended to think about this as a either or in the past, and you hear a lot of debate about, hey, is there still relevance in, for example, the liberal arts and the like in the 21st century job market? And I think for me, the clear implication of a hybrid job market and of its increasing demand for communication skills and other foundational skills is that it has to be a both end. If you are just learning that latest technology skill, you're actually poorly equipped for not only the hybrid jobs of today, but the hybrid jobs of tomorrow, because you need to have a framework on which to hang additional skills. There's a lot of discussion of a T-shaped worker, and I think that of people who have a broad set of skills, but then who have depth. Increasingly, that represents both represents the expectations of employers. In an economy where there are new frames of work, as Claire was describing before, where people turn over faster, employers naturally expect people to come job ready with specific skills, but the nature of those jobs is one in which we are also expecting people to have the core foundations to make use of those skills and bridge across.
That's a very good point. I think that's really interesting. There was another observation. I looked at some of the UK data into it's sort of like a tangential but related point of the types of universities and their engagement with industry. And I think in Australia we tend to think of, research-intensive universities being sort of down the theoretical end of things, and we've even got, clubs of universities that sort of see themselves as being down the practical end of things and closer to industry. It strikes me that if you look at the UK data, you don't have to be either or, and that there are universities like Cranfield, for example, that are research-intensive and heavily engaged in industry. So I think that, and certainly the US, the US is built on that sort of tradition. So that's the other observation. Then you don't have to have either or.
Okay, who else has got questions? Here we are. I'm just going to hand you the microphone, and please, for the sake of the online audience, identify yourself.
My name's John Donahue. I'm just wondering, some of the research that I've seen coming out over the last few years indicates that 70% of people are unhappy in their jobs, and that 70% of people would say to their kids, do not take the job that I've got. How do we go with what you're talking about in the future when people actually will not get very many full-time jobs? How do they go to the bank and say, I want a loan when they're in the gig economy?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, John. Who'd like to take that one?
There's a couple of parts of that.
Yeah, there is.
I'll try to unpack them, perhaps sequentially. So yes, there has always been, and there is certainly no less so today, the mamas don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys kind of thing that goes on. I think that relates in no small part to the kind of prospects that people have for their kind of mobility and their kind of fulfillment. So I think a lot of this comes back, that part of the question at least, comes back to the question of how do we make sure that we have a public infrastructure for giving people a view of their options. We don't tend to do career advising very well, either within the formal structures of universities, of tertiary education, certainly of high schools, and yet we're expecting people to make smart decisions, and usually the only advice they're getting is either don't become what I am, or some meme of the day, which in that sense we haven't progressed very far off Dustin Hoffman and The Graduate, right? Who plastics. We don't tell people to go into plastics today, but the notion of career advice hasn't fundamentally changed. Until we have that kind of data infrastructure to inform people on how to make movements, then I think you're right, people will wind up getting stuck. The good news is that when you start to look at the underlying genome of jobs, it speaks to opportunities for mobility. So even if you are unhappy, in some ways think of it the same as somebody who is at risk of being displaced. I made a mistake, I'm in the wrong first job. I may not need to go back to school and start all over again in order to move to something that may be more rewarding.
And how do I get a loan?
So a couple of things. Some of the freelancing platforms are starting to build in some of the securities that we value so much from our employment regulation. So, for example, Airtasker has made an agreement with the New South Wales Union where they will not put any jobs online which based on the amount of time required to perform them, go below the minimum hourly wage. There are things like holding payment in escrow to make sure that the contractor will get paid if they deliver the work. And I think we need to keep building on mechanisms for this new way of working that give a bit more of the security that people will need. That said, I think all this talk around young people can become entrepreneurs needs some reality testing around the failure rate for entrepreneurs and what it does to a student's long-term prospects if they haven't been able to start accumulating regular income. And the last point I would say is that for me, one of the big great things to have in the future would be something like a digital educational passport where we can keep adding stamps as we add skill sets. And that might not all happen through formal education. Some of it might happen as we begin to recognise what skills a person has demonstrated through their job or through gamification of assessment where you can display what you're already good at. And then if we add that to platforms using data like Burning Glass, where we can say with this skill set, I can add one more and I've got this huge array of options, then we start opening up a universe of possibility.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to say also on that point, because it's a really good question and sort of this related area, but we've got some real industry leaders in the room today. I don't know if any one of those would want to comment, but there's Fiona Anson from JobGetter, there's David Landers, who's senior person at Austrade, John Buchanan's here somewhere from Sydney Uni. Hey, John. Stephen Rudder from Sydney School of Operations and Entrepreneurship. And anyway, Fiona, would you like to have a quick say? Great.
As Liz said, my name is Fiona Anson. I'm from JobGetter. We do a lot of work into the Australian workforce data and analytics. And one of the things, we ran a series of events at the end of last year called the Jobs Agenda around the country with EY. And one of the things we looked at was the impact of education on employment outcomes. And when you look at the jobs that are most in demand at the moment in Australia, they are not jobs that require tertiary education. So building and construction, retail, hospitality, style of workers. And then when you look at the jobs that are growing, things like aged care, childcare, those sorts of work as well. And this, then you add on top of that the ability for us all to be more transitional, because job tenure is getting shorter and the workforce is changing so much. The question that we asked, and that I'd be interested in your feedback on, is what do you see as the future of higher education, and I guess even vocational education, in an environment where everything's getting shorter? And, you know, are we still going to have 4-year degrees and 5-year study periods and 10 years and all of that sort of stuff?
Thanks, Fiona. Okay, who's that one going to go to? Oh, Claire. Okay.
I think some of the answer is that porous boundaries thing, which Ribit is one example of, which is where education must not be cut off from employment, that we will have much more people who are employed but still learning online via platforms which allow them to collaborate with other students. So there's that kind of opportunity. And I'm sorry, I've lost the thread a bit. So maybe I will hand over to the next person.
One of the things that's going to be critical here is a question of access. And how do we provide greater access to people to education? I pointed out before that demand for degrees, for university degrees in particular, is growing, not shrinking. We know that some of those kinds of categories of jobs that constitute a significant portion of the Australian economy and any economy are also ones that are greatest risk of automation. And so you sort of put those things together. On the one hand, it says, hey, you need to go and get a degree. On the other hand, from an access perspective, it is not tenable to necessarily say to people, hey, look, you're a school leaver, you know, and you should go on now and go and get a 4-year university degree. There are universities doing a great job. I was at lunch today with somebody, I think from Western. It was, I think, 70% first-generation college goers. That's fantastic. But that said, if we want to change the mix and we want to see a greater percentage of people earning those degrees that unlock value, then one of the things we need to, exactly to Claire's point, we need to think about other constructions of a degree that allow people to accrue value over time and to accrue university credits over time. Right now, a university degree is one great big exercise in deferred gratification, right? So that's not possible for a lot of people, right? You know, go and do this and eat some kale for a long period of time, and eventually, you know, you'll live longer when you're 70 or 80 or 90, right? That's not all that appealing. On the other hand, if I can, you know, eat a little bit of kale now, make a little bit more money, and then that's a much better structure. And so I think for a lot of people, while 4-year university degrees are valuable and will continue to be valuable, ways of ensuring that people can eventually accrue those degrees while working, because it's economic reality for a lot of people as education becomes more expensive, and is more where each step is in greater line of sight, will open up education to pools of workers who are doing things like being store assistants and the like.
Thanks. I think John Buchanan was waving at me. So after John, we might have one more question, and then we'll break and go next door.
They were very interesting presentations, especially the second one. It's John Buchanan from Sydney Uni, and my question is this: we've heard lots of questions are being asked of education institutions and what should they do, but I don't think we're asking enough of employers. And we've heard today that, you know, employment in one job opens up opportunities for another. All the data shows, however, that employers are reducing their commitments to the workforce. And my colleague down the front here was saying, how do you get a loan in the gig economy? We're basically seeing a massive shift of risk away from the state to households and away from businesses to workers. In that situation, it's very hard to have the coherent transmission of skill. And I'm wondering, should we be opening the debate up? If we're looking at a dynamic economy where there's great mobility, maybe we need to be putting more onus back to employers to take a greater role in actually deepening the skills of the workforce and sharing the risks more equitably. What does the panel think?
Thanks very much, John. So who's going to take this one? No one wants to take it. What about Jobs New South Wales people down there? Charles, Jack, Paul.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think you're spot on that there's two sides to the equation. And I guess another way to phrase it, rather than sort of say it's a responsibility, it's about how do we provide an environment that can encourage companies to grow and then thus create jobs organically. And it seems to me that...
Keep the common property problem. Skills are a common property problem.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, you need to. And I think there's the skills, but there's also, I think, there's a communication issue too, as the data's demonstrated. And it seems to me that, articulation of those skills from the signals from employers as well as to what they need. Yeah. And the loan one, I think, is a good question. I mean, my sense is that there'll be a global platform emerge, which will make home finance, it'll do a lot to home finance, and it'll change probably Australia's, there's a lot of people employed in that sector. We think there's a lot of disruption in other sectors, but I think that's coming, I suspect.
And did you want to say something?
Well, just that one of the implications we believe lies ahead is fewer people in traditional employment conditions, which means that we can't necessarily assume there will be an employer. And I also think that in the knowledge economy, there's a massive advantage in co-workers, that knowledge workers manage to enhance their own skill set and their own productivity, not just from the organisation they work with, but the people they work with. That we've all become much more specialised, and it's by working with other well-skilled and innovative people that we build our skill sets. So to me, the question isn't around making someone else pay for it, but being able to recognise the range of ways in which people are developing their skills and the range of contexts in which we can build our skills.
If I can just ask at that point, right, there's a transaction involved in every one of these exercises. The transaction is, I do work for you and you pay me. If there's no payment, I don't do the work for you. So all those things you talk about, where's the transaction?
So, for example, the new funding models.
I'm building skills with co-workers, right? I'm sitting in a room full of people and we're all being skilled. Where's the transaction?
Well, I'm more thinking of the portfolio workers of the future. So with the individualised funding models in aged care and in community services, there will be customers will have the opportunity to be able to pay their neighbour or some other person around them to deliver a service for them. And so we'll have more people getting paid directly by the consumer. There is no employer in that story. And yet, in those co-working spaces, in the networks that they develop, they possibly are learning new skills, and then they're going to have to fund their own professional development. So that's why I'm nervous about this idea that we put this onto the employer, because there aren't going to be as many big employers.
Look at the national accounts. Just look at the national accounts and the distribution of national income between business profits and wages. The national accounts will still be there. These gains of productivity are going somewhere. That's why I'm raising the question. Who's got the capacity to share the skills?
The organisations have a lot of capital, but they don't have as many workers, so how do we make that translation?
State steps in and
that's a different model.
Yeah, that's a different model. Yeah.
I think there's a couple of levels at which I'd like to address that question. So one is a question of how does it get financed, and there I think there's a fair debate as to whether this is something that happens directly, whether, to your point, there's always going to be a free rider problem, and therefore we solve this through a taxation mechanism. And I think those are all fair points. The other part of this, though, goes sort of beyond the finance question. It gets back to the signaling issue. I talked before about the growing hybridization, which means that there's growing sets of or growing prevalence of, in some ways, highly specialized jobs that are requiring very specific skills and mixes of skills over time. That suggests that employers will become more starved for talent, not less. Now, at some level, that speaks to those kinds of pain points are often referred to as skill gaps. And they are true. And economists often will say, hey, there are no real skill gaps. It's just employers behaving badly. And I can give you plenty of evidence of real skill gaps where there's more postings than there are workers. But at a more fundamental level, those gaps often revolve around a failure to plan. Right? If I go into my local supermarket and say I'm planning a big party for 20 of my closest friends and I need 15 pounds of Arctic char, the guy at the fishmonger is going to say, well, first of all, I don't have Arctic char, and second of all, if I did, I wouldn't have 15 pounds for you. On the one hand, you can say, hey, there's a fish gap. On another hand, if you had called in advance, it would have been all you wanted. I think that's a long-winded way of saying that as those problems become more severe, employers will necessarily have to start to plan. And that gets me back to the question of signals. All sorts of inefficiencies in terms of how demand signals to supply. The place where there's the least opportunity for signal distortion, if you will, is between an employer and that employer's own workers. So as employers get starved for talent and there's specific kinds of jobs in their workforce that they cannot fill, one reaction is to do what they've always done, which is to go out and try to buy talent on the spot market. As the spot market increasingly fails, the other reaction is to provide a map to signal more specifically to your workers and say, Matt, I want to pay you more. Here's what you need to learn. And so that may suggest, in fact, that we may start to see over time a greater resurgence of longer-term employment relationships.
All right, I think we went on for quite a long time on that one, but the thing is that we've got next door with pizza, beer and wine, and we're all able to continue talking to our wonderful panel about those things. I just really wanted to wrap it up at this point, and I think I've certainly found it a great discussion, and we also touched on a few areas that we all sort of feel quite concerned about, and I think it's good to raise all these sorts of things in such a room. Great audience here, as I said before, got some real experts in their respective fields. I'm keen to catch up with most of you out there as well. And I just wanted to say a few things. So first of all, thanks to our fantastic panel today, and in particular with Matt coming over from Boston and his offsider over there, Davor Miskelen, who some of you might know as well. I think this has really added value to everyone's thinking about these issues. I also wanted to say thanks to my fantastic Ribit team for organising this event. Please just join us to say thank you and next door.
Liz, we're actually going to